Hey everybody, and welcome to my introduction to animation. Animation is where the true magic of Blender shines. It's how your scenes and creations come to life. In this tutorial, we'll take our first steps into the world of animation by starting with the basics, animating objects. We'll move some objects around to create simple animations. From there, we'll explore the concept of parenting and discover how to use one object to control others seamlessly. Next, we'll dive into object constraints, powerful tools that can simplify and enhance your animations. We'll also cover shape keys, a technique for distorting and controlling your meshes in creative ways. Finally, we'll introduce armatures and rigging, setting up basic bones, and we'll also look at weight painting to help control model deformation. We won't be making any materials in this video, so I'm going to set my solid view to have random colors. Another object would make this more interesting, so let's add a sphere. We'll move this over on the X. Now we're going to add keyframes using the I key. A keyframe is simply a point where you want your object to be at a specific point in the timeline. We'll look at interpolation in just a bit, but the interpolation is all the frames between your object's keyframes, which are calculated or interpolated by Blender, and is how you get your object from one point to another. When you set a keyframe, it will only apply to the active object or objects. We'll use the same keyframes at the start and end of our animation so that we will have a smooth loop. Now let's keyframe a few points along our timeline where we'd like our objects to be. Be sure to move the point in the timeline before you start moving your objects, or you could inadvertently overwrite your current keyframes. We can also duplicate keyframes with Shift-D and then move them along the timeline with our mouse. We use left-click to accept the placement of duplicated keyframes. Now that our sphere has some motion, let's animate the cube as well. Our objects appear to be intersecting, so let's set the midpoint of our ball a little higher. Now we're going to take a look at some of the interpolation modes I mentioned earlier. These different modes affect how the interpolation calculations are made. My default interpolation mode is currently set to linear, so that is what we have been seeing so far. You can set the default under Edit menu, under Preferences on the Animation tab. We'll use A to select all of our keyframes and then right-click to choose the Interpolation Mode menu item. From there we have several options. Let's take a look at Constant first. This will keep your object at the previous keyframe until it gets to the next keyframe, so the object will jump from place to place, and there will be no transitioning frames in between. One good use for this interpolation mode is when you're animating a camera and you want to cut to a different angle. Now let's take a look at the Bezier interpolation mode. This provides a smoother, more natural looking movement and the ability to adjust the easing by use of curve handles in the graph editor. Another interesting interpolation mode is bounce. And you can see this gives a bouncing effect when the object hits a keyframe. For me, I use linear interpolation most of the time, mostly because I do a lot of motion graphics. As we prepare to look at object parenting, let's go ahead and delete the existing keyframes for both of our objects. We'll move our sphere to the left of our cube. We're going to add a mesh circle for the sphere's parent object. Let's scale this up and apply the scale. Since a mesh circle contains only vertices and edges, this parent would be invisible on render. Now we'll select our sphere and set the parent under Object Properties under Relations. Now we're going to animate the circle in a 360-degree rotation, or one full rotation. We'll keyframe the first position at 0, so our animation will be seamless. We can also keyframe values by hovering over the value box and hitting our shortcut I on the keyboard. Now we can see that our sphere is moving with the complete rotation of the circle. Let's move our cube back to the center. Now let's see what happens to the cube when we parent it to the circle as well. And now the cube moves around following the motion of the circle. Let's go ahead and remove the parent from the cube as we get ready to look at object constraints. The first one we are going to look at is copy rotation. We can see that this gives us the same movement as when we parented the cube to our circle. Let's animate the scale of our sphere and then add another constraint to our cube to copy the scale. Since we were working in top view, I neglected to move my sphere back down on the z-axis. Let's take care of that now. I also need start and end keyframes with my scale at 1, or it will just use the 1 keyframe scale, which won't animate it at all. It would be helpful if I keyframed the z-axis location at the first keyframe as well. Now we can see that both of our objects are scaling and rotating together. Let's briefly look at animating our camera with an object constraint. We'll need to select the camera first, and then we're going to use the Track To constraint to make our camera remain focused on the sphere. We set the sphere as the object we are tracking, and we can see that our camera instantly jumps to focus on the sphere. And when we set our animation in motion, we can see the tracking taking place. There are many different ways to animate your camera to produce some cool effects, but since this is an introductory tutorial, we'll leave those for another time. We're going to delete our circle now, as well as our existing keyframes. Let's also get rid of our existing object constraints as we get ready to look at shape keys, which provide a way to deform your meshes themselves during animation. Shape keys are most often used for facial animation and lip syncing, but we are going to look at a much simpler example just to introduce the concept. The shape keys are kept in the Object Data panel of the Properties editor. Shape keys are added in Object mode and then edited in Edit mode. The first shape key will be called Basis, and that is the default shape of your object. The additional keys are the ones you want to edit, and you can have as many as you like, although too many will likely start to bog down your system. Once the keys have been added, select one that is not the basis, and then go to Edit mode. We are going to take the sphere and lengthen it, and squeeze it together on the X and Y axis. And then in Object mode, we'll select our other shape key and tab back to Edit. Then we're going to squash it on the Z axis and expand it on the X and Y axes. Now let's add a couple of shape keys to the cube as well. We'll deform this one a bit differently. We'll select key 1 and then move the top 4 vertices. Now we go back to Object mode and select our next key. For this one, we will scale the top face of the cube down. Note that you can deform any amount of vertices in any way you need for shape keys. Now let's keyframe our shape keys. Let's add starting and ending positions for both objects. Now we'll keyframe the values for the shape keys. First, we'll keyframe them at 0 at our start and end points. Now let's find a position on our timeline for our first animated keyframe. We'll keyframe the values at frame 80, keyframing the position on the Z-axis first. Then we'll keyframe our shape key values, including the 0 value shape key. Let's also keyframe the values for our cube here too. We'll just make this value about halfway. And we'll choose a second point on the timeline. Let's move our sphere back down on the Z-axis and keyframe the location. Now we'll adjust the values of our shape keys and keyframe them again. We'll also push both of our shape key values to 1 for the cube. Let's rotate the cube and keyframe that as well. And now we can see both in motion. Now let's delete these objects so we can take a look at a simple armature. Let's add a cylinder and scale it a little. Then we are going to move to front orthographic view and move our cylinder up on the Z-axis. Now we'll add an armature with our Shift-A menu. Our bone is currently hidden by our cylinder, so let's go to the Properties Editor Object tab. We'll go down to Viewport Display and set this to In Front, so that our bone will show regardless of the angle we are viewing it from. Now that we can see our bone, let's scale it up. Let's add some loop cuts to our mesh so that we can deform it better. The fewer vertices you have, the less natural your movement will look. Next, we will parent the bone to the mesh by selecting the mesh and then the bone and using Ctrl P and selecting automatic weights. Now we'll switch to pose mode and take a look at how the mesh responds when we rotate the bone. If we grab the bone and move its location, the mesh moves along with it. Let's go back into object mode. Just hitting Tab will take us back to edit mode, but we can get to the pie menu with Control Tab. We'll select just our bone and then go into edit mode again. We can scale it down and then extrude another bone out of the top. Now we need to go back to object mode and reparent the mesh to the bone. We'll select automatic weights again. Now we can see that when we rotate the upper bone, only the upper part of the mesh moves along with it. If we move only the bottom bone, the entire mesh moves. This is due to the hierarchy of the bones, which start at the beginning of the largest end of the default bone shape. If we move the top bone and then adjust the first bone below it, you'll notice that the top bone retains its own rotation, while also rotating as a whole along with the movement of the underlying bone. We can undo each bone's rotation in pose mode by using Alt-R. Let's extrude a third bone. We'll need to reparent our mesh to our bone again. In most projects, you will create all the bones first and then parent them to your mesh. Now let's select our mesh and then we can go into weight painting mode. The bone selected will be the last active bone. Now we're going to adjust the weight painting to alter which parts of the mesh will move along with our top bone. The blue area is the area that will not be affected by the movement, and the red is the area that will be most affected. Let's grab our subtract brush and remove some of the affected area. We can also change our brush with the drop down here. We'll just make this whole edge inactive. Now let's get the add brush and make a different part of the mesh active. Now we can select our armature and go back into pose mode. Let's see how the areas are affected by our weight painting. Usually, adjustments in the weight painting are needed when too much of our mesh is getting affected by the armature movement, such as when you have a bone for a character arm that also displaces the shoulder unnaturally. Now let's go back and readjust our weight paints. We'll return to pose mode and animate our poses by adding keyframes. We want to gradually curl our mesh So we will be sure to keyframe the other bone straight while we bend the top one. Now we'll rotate our second bone. And now let's rotate our bottom bone. Now we can use Alt-R to undo our rotations. So we are pretty much doing the same keyframes in reverse order to unbend our mesh. Now let's take a look at the animation. Now we're going to take a look at how scaling the bones can affect our mesh. I don't think I made that scale extreme enough to show the effect. Let's redo those keyframes. Subtle may be better for real-world animation, but as a demo, I really want you to see the effect. And this brings us to the end of this tutorial. Today we took our first steps into the world of animation in Blender. We explored the basics of moving, scaling, and rotating objects, learned how parenting can help control objects, and experimented with object constraints and shape keys. We wrapped up with an introduction to armatures and how bones can bring our meshes to life. While this was just an introductory tutorial with simple examples, it's a solid starting point for diving deeper into animation. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. I'd love to help. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss future tutorials. Next time we'll be taking a look at Geometry Node, a powerful tool for creating dynamic and flexible animations like these. I wish you all a very happy blendering.